From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. It's been almost a year since wildfires devastated northern New Mexico, including agricultural land and many people's livelihoods. Today's guests are going to tell us about the post-disaster landscape and what different groups and agencies are doing both to keep people working and thriving and to help build more resilience before the next fire, flood, and drought, and what some of the barriers are. That's right after these announcements. This program is sponsored by the Greenhorns. Listeners to Down to Earth might enjoy the newly released 6th edition of the New Farmer's Almanac, a literary miscellany written by and for working agrarians. This year's volume is called Adjustments and Accommodations, and it's full of essays, poetry, and images that explore how people are facing challenges and uncertainties on the land. Learn more and order your copy at greenhorns.org. This program is sponsored by the Agrarian Trust. Agrarian Trust is charting a new path forward for the land trust movement. They're advancing an innovative and robust model of land ownership in which agrarianism, social and environmental justice, community well-being, and the earth itself are seen as fundamentally intertwined. They're doing this by helping regenerative farmers and ranchers to secure long-term, affordable land leases. That helps to strengthen local food systems and to transform community relationships to the land across the country. Visit agrariantrust.org to learn more. And now to our program. I'm really happy now to welcome Shantini Ramakrishnan. She's director of the Conservation and Restoration Education Program at the Conservation Science Center, which is at the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute at Highlands University. Welcome, Shantini, to Down to Earth.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So you are working with the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute, which has been doing really good work for many years, mapping and monitoring the watersheds of northern New Mexico, working on restoration projects to make the land more resilient. This is all kind of long-term work. What was it like when the wildfires happened last summer and basically you had to kind of go into disaster response mode? How did you respond? What was that time like for you and your colleagues?
It was a very surreal time. We've always known that these watersheds were vulnerable, but when that fire hit, it hit in such a scale and at such a intensity that it was really hard to wrap our heads around it. And initially it was very real, it was very tactile, there was ash falling from the sky, there was smoke. People we knew, our own colleagues and friends were evacuated. But a few of us started talking about what happens next. There is obviously the immediate needs of people. People needed a place to stay, shelter, food, water. They needed a place for their animals and livestock. But then there was also what would happen after a fire of this scale, and what that would mean for us living in this area for the next 3 to 5 years in post-fire recovery, which can be very intense and can have some very devastating post-fire flooding. But then there's also the recovery of the next 10, 20 years. And that planning and that thinking needs to start right away because we are looking at a scale of a wildfire of 340,000 acres. There's also the very real possibility that this is not the last wildfire we'll see in the coming years. And so we responded in a way that we thought leverage our expertise and experience in this area and filled a niche that we didn't think was being filled at the time. So there was a lot of information coming in about programs and funding opportunities and different aid packages that community members could apply for. But we realized very quickly that all of us as a community and as individuals needed to learn a lot about post-fire recovery very quickly. And so we took that piece and we made it into what we hope is an accessible and frequently available program. And so one of the first things we did was to launch the Querencia in Action post-fire workshops. So these are hands-on workshops that are open to any landowner and that is hosted on private working lands that were affected by the fire. So we were learning in places where we could see the devastation of the fire could actually relate to the severity in that particular site, and then what you can do to address some of the challenges that we were all facing at the time. And so these workshops range from contour felling, so ways to stabilize hill slopes. It also included erosion control using rocks as well as charred trees, which we suddenly had a lot of. We looked at rehabilitating dozer lines because there were many miles of dozer lines and fire breaks that ran throughout the burn scar and across a lot of private lands. We also looked at what to do with our forests that didn't burn. So we had these green pockets. We wanted to keep them green. And so there were considerations on how to keep those forests that didn't burn safer in case another fire came through. And there were also concerns about what to do with the burn forest. So do we keep the trees up? Do we cut them down? Are bark beetles an issue? Those were the sorts of questions that community members had. So we ran a series of workshops in forests to answer some of those questions and to facilitate those conversations. Once the monsoon hit, we actually saw a tremendous growth of vegetation. A lot of grasses and wildflowers came up, and a lot of plants that we had never seen before started to appear. And there was a lot of questions about, are we concerned? Are these invasive species? Are these plants we like? Some of the plants were actually recognized as being plants that hadn't been seen for many years, even decades. And so we actually ran a couple of botanical-based workshops on post-fire plant communities. What are we seeing? Why are we seeing them? Where we're seeing them, right? What are some of the attributes of that particular spot that a particular plant might like? What are some of the medicinal or traditional uses of these plants that might be of interest? And we also talked about and did a whole workshop on seed collection. So how do you identify when a seed is ripe and ready to be harvested? How do you store them properly if you're not going to put them back out in the landscape right away? How do you harvest in a way that's ethical so that you're not over-harvesting a site? And how do you think about seed harvesting as potentially something you could do in the coming years and cultivate sites for propagation where you're seeing populations of plants coming in that you want to see more of and increase the diversity on your land? So those were a series of workshops we ran. We're actually starting them back up again in the spring. And we're starting a series of workshops on survivable space. So really, while we're very aware that a fire can come through again, we're approaching the 1-year anniversary, we are seeing a very windy spring again, this is the time that we can actually do a little bit more to save the structures that we still have so that if a wildfire happens, it doesn't turn into a structure fire. We are living in an area, in a region where wildfires and communities do interact, and we want to make sure that those communities, our communities, continue to thrive, continue to persist, but that means we have to adapt to the occurrence of wildfires in our lives. And there are things and steps that we can do to make our structures and the infrastructure that we put in these spaces more resilient to fires that may occur.
How were farmers and ranchers specifically affected by the fires? What were their challenges?
So a lot of ranchers leased land on public land. So some of their ability in areas that they were dependent on for forage for their cattle and livestock were lost. And lost for, we're not entirely sure how long. And so that one's hard to predict how long you would have to buy hay, lease another place, or reduce the size of your herd. And so those are things that are hard to plan for. There are also obviously just some losses of, if your own land burned hard, then some of the meadows came back pretty well. But we also had this huge movement of sediment. So if your meadow is adjacent to a forest hill slope that burned really hard, we had a lot of sediment that came down the hill slope, hit the meadow and then covered it with a combination of soil and pine needles and just char and ash. And that could smother the grasses that had recovered. And it's hard to actually get rid of that without completely scraping the topsoil off your meadow. So that's not really a good solution. And so a lot of forage was lost. For farmers, a lot of irrigation ditches and infrastructure in acequias are just completely inundated. And even if they come up with a solution to clean all of that, which I believe they are close to doing so, it's probably going to be time just before the next monsoon, and then unfortunately, those ditches will get inundated again, which means we can't move water to places where we need it to grow. And so that piece is extraordinary. It's extraordinary for the medium term, for the next 3 to 5 years. We will see a lot of these effects flush out and stabilize. But the irony is, up until last year, we had so little rain for so long. And then suddenly now we're actually getting pretty steady monsoon seasons, pretty steady rains daily in some cases. And in a post-fire landscape, even a modest event can move a lot of water and can move a lot of sediment. And that's overwhelming a lot of growing infrastructure and forest production.
Now, disaster response on the scale of a wildfire is something that obviously no one nonprofit or government agency responds to by itself. It's a community project. Who were the different groups that responded, and how did you coordinate with each other and with the people who most needed the assistance?
So we had partners that we've been working with for years, but never in this sort of context. So, for example, our local soil and water conservation district, we had Tierra y Montes, which works in San Miguel County and Western Mora. That was in Mora County. We have our New Mexico State Forestry Division. They're also close partners. The Forest Service, of course. Our local community foundation, Las Vegas Community Foundation. These are organizations that have always been here. We don't usually, generally speaking, work with FEMA. We don't usually, generally speaking, work with the Department of Homeland Security. And so those were newer agencies to us that obviously show up after a disaster. And so that was new context that we had to make. One thing that the Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute was able to do was introduce and build what is called a hub site. And it's simply an online platform that allows us to use it as a coordinating staging ground. There is a public-facing piece to it, so it's open access and anybody can get to it, and that's where we listed calendar events of workshops, public events, any sort of informational meetings that was happening. We used that as a coordinating site. When our long-term recovery group, which is a group that gets set up after a disaster, when they formed and came to being last year, we also gave them a platform on that hub site as well. And it turned into a far more useful resource than we had envisioned. And it's something that we're actually continuing to expand and build on because it became just a practical way to collaborate. Sometimes we just need practical solutions to problems that shouldn't be that big a deal, but can be.
Talk about some of the challenges. I mean, even when a set of bureaucracies and a set of groups is able to coordinate, there are still problems, there's still red tape. What are some of the challenges that you saw?
So, for example, the HPCC Assistance Act, the new bill that's been passed that is intended to make people whole, that piece hasn't quite launched yet. And so there is a little bit of hesitation that it is going to take a long time, that it's going to be obstructive, that it's just going to be a difficult process. And that hesitation can lead to people not applying for aid. And that would be unfortunate because that is really the source of a lot of funding that was built on the template that came out of the Cerro Grande Fire in Los Alamos. And it was fought for very vigorously by our state representatives. And it would be unfortunate if that aid did not get to the people who were impacted by the fire, because that was the entire intent of it. And so at the recent fairs, we did have a case officer who has been in the area for a while, who is going to be here for the long haul, simply just present and available to answer any questions that folks might have, as well as provide information and guidance on the kind of documents and the kind of information that needs to be collected and compiled. And so it's great to have someone that's going to be around because you establish familiarity. Some of the losses are very personal. To apply for these programs, it's not easy to recount all the losses repeatedly again and again and again, right? And so you do want to establish trust with people. You do want to actually see a caseworker that you're going to see again, as opposed to being passed around. So that is something that we're seeing that was different from the initial FEMA process. An improvement, we think, that there's going to be a little bit of stability, and that they're coming out ahead of the program being officially launched simply to provide information. We are also looking at that information to see if we can provide very concrete examples. And so we are looking to be, in some ways, an informational resource and maybe a little bit of a translator of what that means. And so if we can actually provide that, then we'll craft something out and then also put that on the hub site and share it widely on any events that we have, so that we're spreading the information in multiple ways. Sometimes the websites are great, social media is fantastic, but for rural communities, sometimes it also means putting information out at post offices and libraries and senior centers. We really do need to meet people where they're at and not assume that everybody's going to come to us in the one way that we communicate and work.
Right. One thing that happens after disasters, and this is everywhere. I mean, I remember Hurricane Katrina and so many other things, where people tend to leave an area where they've lost their home, settle in other places, and don't necessarily come back. What kind of efforts have there been to keep people in the community?
So there are two specific efforts. This is an issue that we were very, very worried about, because when something like this happens, your ability to live, your livelihoods, especially in rural communities that are based on land-based livelihoods, that ability to harvest firewood or to cut lithias or to collect, landscaping rock, or all the different ways that many community members make a living, they're taken away. Right? And like for farmers, especially now, our acequias and irrigation ditches are all filled with sediment, and it may not be viable to plant for a couple of years, but the bills still come. There's no stopping on the bills, right? And so at some point, families are forced to make a living, and sometimes that means moving away. And it can be devastating, especially for a rural community that isn't very densely populated in the same way. We can see that outsourcing out population of people. And so the workforce piece has been a nagging sort of issue that a few of us have been chewing on, because we don't want to see that outmigration happen. A lot of the local community members here are very self-reliant. They have to be, right? And a lot of the skills they have in harvesting firewood, in growing and cultivating Christmas trees, in a lot of that sort of ranching lifestyle, you have skills that are practical and useful for living in rural areas. And those are also the same skills that you would need for post-fire recovery. So the comfort in using and experience in using chainsaws is great. A burn tree is a little bit different, but at least you have years of experience and the knowledge to use it. So really, in some ways, you're better and ahead of the game when we are thinking about, okay, how do I fell all these trees in a way that I can stabilize this hill slope and help the recovery of that hill slope over a quicker time scale, essentially. and not cause further erosion downstream or further issues downstream. And so one program that we're really trying to set up is called the Wildfire Resiliency Center, and that's actually a joint program with Luna Community College. And so we're working with our community colleges, which are set up really for workforce development, for retraining, for setting up exactly these sorts of programs, to create and develop short courses and certifications that would essentially offer a retraining program. So these are community members who have lost the means of making a living, retrain a lot of their skills that they already have in a post-fire lens so that they can go back out into the same lands that they live and work in and have, raised their children in, to utilize those skills towards making the land more resilient for recovery as well as for future fires that may come through.
And is that actually happening?
There's interest in it. Funding is still being sought after. There's been a lot of discussions about it. What I like about the Wildfire Resiliency Center is that it takes a more holistic approach. So there is the pre-fire piece, right? So there's really the land restoration piece. How do we keep our lands in an area that interacts with wildfire, so areas that are called, generally speaking, fire sheds? How do we make them more resilient so that when a fire comes through, we don't get a catastrophic event? Then there is also the part of the firefighting itself, right? Firefighting is a tough job, but we are seeing more and more catastrophic wildfires, and so we want to have more people dedicated towards that job, but it is a very seasonal job, extremely seasonal. But again, same skill. So if you can fight fires, you can also be involved in in just land restoration work. And then there's the post-fire recovery piece as well. And so that the same people can work during a fire, they can work before a fire, they can work after a fire, so that they're not seasonal work that depends on the ebb and flows of economics or other matters that we really don't have a lot of control over.
Another thing that you've been involved in is working with young people in a kind of outdoor classroom where they go actually into the burn scar, which may or may not, depending on the kid, be a traumatizing thing in itself, and learn about what? Plants, trees, ecological systems?
All of the above. So the program I'm involved in, the Conservation Science Center, was really designed to build future natural resource leaders from our local communities. Now, when this event happened, when the Hermit's Peak Half Canyon Fire happened, there was the risk, as we mentioned before, of outmigration. So families may leave, and there goes my youth, there goes my future leaders, right? And so the connection to the land, even a land that's altered and burned, is important if the local community is to stay involved in post-fire recovery. And that means, to some extent, desensitizing the engagement in that changed landscape. So if you grew up here and you have beautiful memories of hunting and fishing and taking your cattle out to meadows and growing crops here, and now that land has changed and you don't want to interact with it, then the chances of you investing and thinking about how that land is going to recover is lost. And all that knowledge and experience is lost with it. And so together with Moya Independent School District, with Collins Lake Ranch, with the Lano Foundation, and us at the Conservation Science Center, we came together and started the Moya Friday Outdoor School. Now, the district was always a fan of expeditionary learning, place-based learning, and that sort of thing. They really wanted that model, which you almost never see in a public school, almost unheard of. They wanted very much that their students and their youth should have the opportunity to learn outside, to use their lived experiences, because a lot of these kids are, ranching kids, right? They know the land in ways that we don't often reinforce or give credit for in a traditional classroom. But it can reinforce those lessons very well when you actually apply your classroom content with how it is applicable to your life outside. And so when this fire happened, we were able to bring, not just us, the four partners were able to collaborate in a way that allowed us to bring students out to a safe but burned landscape, right? So there are considerations in working in a post-fire landscape related to safety. So we needed a site that was willing to take us in for sure, and as well as had different severities of burns, so we could work in an area that was safe to engage students. And then we wanted to provide alternative experiences in that landscape. So that meant that they were learning, they were playing, they were interacting in this area, and it wasn't only going to be triggering memories of loss. We wanted that to also trigger other memories and other experiences so that they would stay in that space.
And has that worked out pretty well?
The great thing about the outdoors is that it's outdoors. The not so great thing about the outdoors is the weather and everything that comes with it. So sometimes we are adapting on the fly a little bit. But it was really cool to see the resilience in youth. They were able to not just play and engage in that space, but really actually process the events. We didn't shy away from the burn. We didn't shy away from fire ecology. We didn't shy away from the sediment and the charcoal and everything that was in the ground. We used that as an educational tool. And the students were great. I mean, they're seeing impacts to their wells. They're seeing impacts to their water. They're seeing impacts to the land that used to grow crops. So they're seeing all of these things and understanding how these processes will work, what to expect in the coming years, is useful in planning ahead as they and their families kind of process all recent events. That was also why we staged even our adult workshops, our post-fire workshops, we staged it in burn areas because we also do believe all of us need to engage in that different altered landscape in a way that we can still be in it, learn from it, and move towards what's in the future.
Another piece of working with young people is I love how you're thinking really long term, and one of the long term concepts is working with young people and identifying kids who might be future leaders, future scientists. That's really a part of the big picture in keeping people in the community.
It is. We tend to aspire to things that we're good at. And we become good at something when we try it and have the time to get good at something. And so much of how we become who we become is based on experiences and opportunities that we often have no control over. And so if I can even remotely open up the realm of what science is, what is science? It's beyond just working in a lab space. It's beyond just white coats and PPE, right? Sometimes science is spending weeks in the forest or playing in our rivers. I call it playing, but if you really love what you do, there is a fair amount of play in it. And I don't think it is well known that a lot of science actually involves fieldwork, and fieldwork means spending time in beautiful, wonderful places that a lot of people grew up in and know very well. And so there are certainly more traditional science jobs, and those are important too, right? We need nurses, we need EMTs, we need mental health professionals. Those are all worthwhile and wonderful professions that we need right here in this community. But we also need freshwater ecologists. We also need people to work with our fish species. We need people to work in our forests. We need people who are range and soil specialists, right? But what does that mean and what does that look like? Well, you're not going to know until you hang out with someone who does that kind of work and spend a day tromping around with them and really getting your world just opened up and asking the questions and maybe finding out, to your surprise, that you're really good at something that you would have never had the chance to try.
You've talked about resilience, and resilience is kind of a buzzword in regenerative agriculture, in ecosystems, and there's probably multiple definitions of it, but I wonder what resilience means to you as a scientist, as somebody who's working in the watersheds and in the ecosystems of northern New Mexico, and what you're learning about resilience from the last fire that you could put into practice in, there's going to be future fires.
Yes, you're right. Resilience has so many different definitions. And I take resilience to generally mean that we can coexist and thrive with some of the ecological processes that this region came out of. And that means that fire is not something of the past. Fire is probably something that will continue to be part of our current and future. And that means learning how to live with it and learning that a fire doesn't have to be a devastating event. We are a long way from that. And that is okay, because resilience is a giant concept. It's not something that can be answered if you do step 1, 2, 3. What we can do, however, is to adopt more fire adaptive attitudes and behaviors. And that is in and of itself a pretty big ask. Part of the reason we're running survivable space workshops is to introduce some of these fire adapted behaviors. So if you're going to live here and thrive here, there are some things that come with that. So just as you may work on the soil before planting season, living in a fire shed means you also have to do some work to successfully live here and protect your home. And we want that to become more commonly practiced, because it makes the effects of a wildfire less devastating if it doesn't transfer from a wildland fire to a structural fire. Right? That's where a lot of our losses come from. Not exclusively. I'm not suggesting that a catastrophic wildfire that doesn't involve structures is not devastating. There are still losses to a lot of lands and wildlife and medicinal plants that are very impactful as well. But a lot of focus tends to be the loss of livelihoods and the human aspect to it. And it is the humans who stay here that could actually impact the transition of overgrown forest into healthier forest. And so we need the humans to stay involved in that process. And that means we have to adapt to fire being part of our lives. And so the piece that we're piloting this coming year is, sometimes we attend a workshop or we attend a webinar and we have the best intentions. We're going to go there, we're going to learn it, and we're going to put things into practice. But then life happens, right? And we get busy and things get too hard. So one thing that we're going to introduce this year, and just to try it out, is community action days. And so we're going to take things a little further and say, okay, we've done, so for example, we're going to do survival space workshops. But the one thing I'm gathering from these workshops are, if I brought a chipper to you,
like a wood chipper,
right? Would you cut the slash that could then be chipped, right? So community chipper days are not a new concept. They're not a new concept at all, but they tend to be in, I would say, more affluent areas where people contract other people to do the work. We are in a community that generally likes to do a lot of work themselves, but we don't have good solutions for green waste. So we have a problem, right? We have green waste that we don't have anywhere to put it, which is a barrier for you cutting the waste, right? If you're going to cut slash and harden your home, but then you don't have anywhere to put it, is it a good thing that you cut it in the first place? Because now it's just going to dry, and now you've got a pile of dry fuel on your land, right? And so if we brought you more resources, would you meet us halfway to do the work so that we can then get rid of that green waste for you? And so we're going to pilot it out. We're gathering some data right now to see who wants to be involved, how many people we can line up, and then we'll try it. And again, that is a way for us to reward adaptive behaviors and efforts that people are making. And if we can reduce the fuel loads and harden homes, everybody is safer, including our volunteer firefighters, who are really part of the community. We don't want their jobs to be unsafe. They've already done a whole lot, and they're really our local heroes.
When you say harden homes, you mean make them sort of more fireproof or fire resistant?
Yes,
Yeah.
fireproof, yeah.
And just to build on the whole question of green waste and wood chippers and all of that, people are familiar with wood chippers. They may not be familiar with something like biochar, but one leads to the next. We did a program not too long ago on biochar. We'll do some more, but it's basically a way of turning green waste into a char that could be spread over land that makes the land a lot more resilient.
Yes, I'm really fascinated by biochar as a way to use a waste product, right? Here we're taking a waste product, we are altering its state, and when you put it back in the land, it doesn't add fuel to that land. In fact, it increases the water holding capacity of the land. The issue with biochar currently is that it still requires ignition. It is a very safe ignition, it's contained, but there is still a lot of caution right now with fire. And even something as safe and as shielded as a biochar kiln is still causing a little bit of apprehension. I hope that will change, but we'll see. And if we can get community action days as a thing that people respond to, then how different would it be to cut slash for a chipper or for a kiln? It wouldn't make any difference. If there is that response and there is that ability for us to instigate community action, then the mechanism is there for us to do this with biochar as well in the future.
Anything else that you want to let people know or talk about before we go?
I think that there is still so much that we're processing in the last few years. Sometimes we forget that we're still in this, there's still a lot of losses that have happened even before the fire from COVID-19 and the pandemic. And the compounding effects of a lot of that loss has also long-standing effects. And so we don't often talk about mental health as a thing, but I think it would be safe to say that the last 3 years has been incredibly stressful, and that seeking out help for how to process that loss is not something we maybe pay enough attention to. And so there are definitely a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but there are certainly some resources out there that I think are useful to check out. Agencies like LifeLink, the National Latino Behavioral Health Association. We also have AgWell. These are institutions and agencies really that focus on rural communities, focus on agricultural communities, and all the stresses that come with just ordinary life. And then now that we've added all these other stresses to it, I think it can actually have a longer term effect to our overall well-being than we may realize. And so these are resources that are for the most part free and accessible and should be something that people consider checking out.
Shantini Ramakrishnan, thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Thank you, Mary Charlotte. It was a pleasure.
If you want to find out more about the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute, you can go to nmfwri.org. You're listening to Down to Earth, and there's more to today's program. After these brief announcements, we'll be talking to Jonas Moya of the New Mexico Farm Service Agency. The New Mexico Coalition to Enhance Working Lands is holding its annual summit this April 19th from 10 to 4 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The summit has been a space where people have been able to come together, put words into action, and step into another year of adapting to a changing climate. This year, the gathering will explore the places where production, policy, and people intersect to enhance working lands. Lunch will be provided and registration is free. Please register at nmcewl.org/annual summit. And Quivira is excited about a new webinar series being produced by their new agrarian program. It's called the New Agrarian Toolkit, a webinar series to dig deeper and level up. These webinars are hosted monthly beginning April 12th. The series is inspired by years of talking to new agrarians about their experiences in a life new to agriculture and how to best build a career in the ag world today. It is for any beginning agrarian seeking to dive deeper into topics ranging from soil health, small ruminants, or building an online presence. See the full list of webinars and register at quiviracoalition.org/events. And Quivira is Quivira. I'd like now to welcome Jonas Moya. He's State Executive Director of the New Mexico Farm Service Agency in Albuquerque. Welcome to Down to Earth.
All right. Thank you, Mary Charlotte. I appreciate the invitation and honored to be a part of the podcast this morning.
Thanks. It's great to have you. Tell us, first of all, what the Farm Service Agency does here in New Mexico.
The primary mission of the Farm Service Agency here in New Mexico is to ensure the success of farmers and ranchers throughout the state. So we have a variety of programs and technical assistance that we're able to provide to our producers. And the unique thing is that we have staff represented in all 33 counties. So no matter where you're at in the state, you're able to access our programs or our loans, as well as any of our technical assistance. So we're a really unique agency, specifically targeted to farmers and ranchers and making sure that they're successful during these volatile times and these volatile markets.
So there's farms and ranches in every county of New Mexico, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And there's a wide variety of size of ranches and farms from, very small, maybe 1 acre to, thousands of acres. And that's the beautiful thing about New Mexico is the variety of farms and ranches, as well as the variety of crops and produce and livestock that are grown on those farms and ranches.
What are some of the challenges that operations of different sizes have, like the challenges of the really big farms and ranches, the small, the medium-sized ones? They must be really facing kind of different problems.
Oh, they absolutely are. Just like any business, any kind of small business or business in general in New Mexico, farmers and ranchers are struggling with finding labor, and they're also struggling with keeping up with increased operating costs. Just like any business, everything gets more expensive, but you can only sell your product or your crop or your livestock at a certain price sometimes. So they're experiencing those same constraints when it comes to finding labor, competing with increased operating costs, as well as, the ever-changing consumer preferences that are going on. And those are some of the main challenges going on here for New Mexico farmers and ranchers.
What do you mean by ever-changing consumer preferences? What are some examples of that?
As trends occur, whether it's dietary trends or trends in types of products that are used as a main ingredient for other products within the value chain, those preferences are also, they're all controlled by the consumer. And oftentimes the producers, which are, very skilled and sometimes that's their niche, they grow that certain product that has been the staple item for maybe as a main ingredient for something that, goes into another product. And when those consumer preferences change and that product is no longer wanted, the rancher and the farmer are the main, they feel those effects.
Right.
One example would be, as there's been dietary shifts within the dairy industry when we have a wide variety of different types of milks, whether it's, dairy milk from cattle, or milk from almonds or cashews or almonds. There's just those type of changes that happen every day in the marketplace.
So like in New Mexico, dairy might not be selling as much milk because all of a sudden everyone's drinking so-called nut milk.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, like little changes in people's diets as well, changing from beef to chicken or to pork. Our producers have to make those adjustments as those happen in real time in the markets.
Yeah, and they probably are stuck with the most risk because a grocery store can put a different product in their shelf, but it's a lot harder for a rancher to pivot from beef to chicken, for example.
Oh, absolutely. It really is. And that's a whole operation change, and a lot of these farmers and ranchers, they're generational. They've been growing the same product for years, for generations. Their great-grandfather grew corn and their grandfather grew corn, just as an example. So it's very hard to make those changes. The beautiful thing that we are seeing, though, is that a lot of these beginning farmer and ranchers and these young farmers and ranchers are starting to make those changes. They're listening to the markets. They're willing to try new technology and explore value adding as well as just working with new technology. So that's exciting. And that's one change in the marketplace. The other one, which I wanted to make a note of as well, is just growing practices and preferences on just how products are produced are also ever changing. And as markets make those suggestions as a requirement to sell in certain markets, like maybe free range chickens or something like that, producers have to make those changes as well. So that's another example of, reacting to consumer preferences.
Has the introduction of so-called fake meat into the marketplace had an effect on New Mexico ranchers?
I directly don't know any of the numbers or the effects that the meat alternatives have displaced or disrupted the New Mexico specific market. But I think in general, it's just going to be more competition in the field, as that's another product consumers can choose from. So I definitely feel like there's going to be some effects from having that alternative protein within that market. Time is going to be the only indicator that's going to really tell us how that's going to affect our farmers and ranchers. But adding that additional product to the space will definitely hurt already thin margins, and really it's really going to probably put a strain on a already very hard industry to make pencil out.
What are some of the particular challenges for farmers and ranchers in New Mexico that are maybe different from other states?
Yeah, so some of the unique challenges is, I would say, it's our diverse landscapes throughout the state. So we have a variety of soil types, so each producer kind of has to be a real expert in what and how to grow in the counties and in the areas that they live in. So that's definitely a unique standpoint in making sure that we understand our soils and understand how to grow within our state. Another unique challenge is we don't have that much processing or value adding within our state. So we, unlike other states, a lot of our products are shipped out of state in the raw form. So, we make a lot of salsa here in New Mexico, but I'm going to use salsa as an example. A lot of the products that we use to make salsa will be grown here locally on a farm. Onions, chili, some tomatoes. And oftentimes we have to ship those products out to be processed and canned and turned into that final salsa product. So we have limited access to actual value adding here in New Mexico. So that's a unique challenge. As well as, New Mexico, we're still a relatively small state. So labor is another big challenge that is always unique to New Mexico, especially shift labor or hard labor, going out into the fields and harvesting crops and working those long hours. So that's another unique challenge for New Mexico.
What you're saying really makes me think about the issue of immigration. That is often, for better or for worse, immigrant labor doing that kind of jobs. Is there a short supply of immigrant labor these days?
I would most definitely say that, there definitely is a short supply of immigrant labor. I haven't talked to many of our producers just specifically on that subject, but, I know labor in general on farm and working on a ranch is very limited. We used to heavily rely on immigrant labor and people coming in for a little bit to just work in the fields. And over the last couple of years, that's been very limited compared to years past.
Yeah. What have the droughts and floods been like over the last few years in New Mexico? Do you feel like you're seeing significant changes in weather patterns?
Yeah, so the world around us is definitely changing, and New Mexico is feeling those effects. Drought has been prevalent for almost 10 years, and it's kind of spotty because New Mexico is such a big state. Some areas of the state are still, lacking a lot of moisture, while some other areas have received a good amount of moisture within the last 2 years, and they're able to kind of bounce back, but they're still kind of hurting from those previous years of severe drought. So drought is still a major factor in New Mexico, and, our producers are still reacting to years past of horrible drought and what it's done to their soil and what they had to do to make adjustments to their livestock herds. And then when it comes to flooding, most recently we've had some severe flooding just around the state due to some of the wildfires that we've had occur over the last year. What I've learned a lot of over the years about wildfires and how that burn scar really just makes the soil into a hard surface like a tin roof. And once that water hits that hard soil, it just washes down and it runs into severe flooding. So we're going to be feeling those effects for a while. And we're just, the FSA and USDA is just going to be there for our producers as they navigate through those challenges, whether it's severe drought, increased amounts of flooding due to wildfires, and any other natural disasters that occur.
Talk about some of the specific programs that you have that help farmers in these different ways.
Absolutely. So we have a number of different disaster programs. And a disaster could be from anything from, the severe flooding, drought, to any other number of natural disasters. So we have livestock programs that are designed to help producers recoup a little bit of the cost of that animal that has perished from a natural disaster. And that's up to 75% of that animal's market value. And we use a national average to come up with those prices. So we have a price sheet that we're able to utilize to then reimburse producers up to 75% for any livestock that's lost from a natural disaster. We also have forage and water hauling programs where during these severe disasters such as drought, we're able to assist producers actually with their increased cost of purchasing more hay or having to haul more water to their livestock due to the lack of water. So we're able to help them absorb a little bit of those increased costs as they go through those hard times. Additional programs when it comes to flooding and wildfires is our emergency conservation program, which for rangeland and farmland is available to help producers do debris removal as well as repair fence. It's a cost share program, so the producer will have to put up a little bit of money to participate, but it's a really good program just to help producers get back on their feet. A similar program to that is also our emergency forest restoration program. That's a program more designed for heavily forested areas or orchards, and that allows producers to get some assistance in replanting trees, debris removal, as well as repairing fence in heavily forested areas when there is a wildfire or a severe flood.
It seems like, farmers take so much risk, we know this, and they're continually engaged in one type of risk management or another. That must make it tricky for farmers who also want to try new things.
Oh, it absolutely does. And, that's where coming up with a solid business plan really comes into play. And, that's another unique service of FSA. And as a producer myself, coming from a cow-calf operation and doing some dryland farming back in eastern New Mexico, I encourage everybody that's in agriculture to come and develop those relationships with their local farm service office, talk through what they're wanting to do with their operation, and get some good constructive feedback so that they can be successful. That's what we're here for. We're here to help people grow, whether it's through our loans or help people survive the hard times, which is through our programs. I wholeheartedly believe that agencies like ourselves, like the Farm Service Agency and NRCS and rural development, we're that backbone and that support structure for rural New Mexico and rural America, and we're happy to be a part of it and keep our rural communities and our rural lifestyles alive.
The different agencies that you just mentioned, do you guys communicate with each other? Do you have kind of a coordinated strategy for helping rural communities?
Oh, absolutely. We're in constant communication as some of our programs complement each other. I know us at the FSA really work closely with the NRCS. Oftentimes the NRCS is actually our technical lead on a lot of our programs, so they'll go out there and do site visits for us and help producers come up with practices like installation of fences or repair of dirt tanks or watering tanks. So we're in constant communication with all our sister agencies, and then it's the same for rural development. We have a really good relationship with them, and just making sure that anything that they're able to provide also can maybe complement a farmer or rancher. So yes, at the state level and definitely at the county level, we're in constant communication. And it's funny too, we oftentimes share buildings. So we all work within under the same roof.
That's helpful, yeah.
Yeah, so it's usually a one-stop shop for USDA services. If if you go down to your local county office, you're more than likely to find NRCS and FSA as next door office mates.
Right. So you have plenty of chance to have lunch together or talk and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really has excelled over the last 2 years and just building up that communication. And I know that's just a main focus of the current administration is that we have these talks, and we talk not only between our federal partners, but also our state partners. And I oftentimes, have really good conversations with the New Mexico Department of Agriculture and all the other organizations that represent New Mexico agriculture.
And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, NRCS stands for Natural Resources Conservation Service. Just want to...
Us, the federal government, we have lots of acronyms.
I know. They are everywhere. How can New Mexico, consumers, eaters, people who aren't farmers themselves, who aren't necessarily involved in the farm system at all, but how can they support local and regional farmers and ranchers?
Wow, there's so many ways that we can support our local and regional farmers and ranchers, and it always starts with going to the farmers market. That's one of the really big, easy ways to support local agriculture and some of the real, what I believe are the innovators of agriculture. These are the folks that are figuring out new ways to grow with less land or less resources. So going to local farmers markets, visiting with them, purchasing their products, but also, you could support local and regional farmers by going to grocery stores and outlets that, also sell their products. I know NMDA has in New Mexico, I believe tourism. The state of New Mexico actually has really been doing a good job of promoting local products. So that I know they have a directory and a whole bunch of information on how to buy local and how to support local.
This is the New Mexico Department of Agriculture?
Yes, the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. Yeah, I would highly encourage you to check out their website and see some of the information that they have available for supporting local. Yeah, but that's one way. So, other ways is if you live in rural New Mexico, the biggest way is just stay involved, be a part of those communities, and that's going to really uphold what's going on with rural agriculture.
If you could give one piece of advice to New Mexico farmers and ranchers from your perspective, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a great question. One piece of advice, I would say continue to build that relationship with the Farm Service Agency at the local level. Come into your local office, get to know your local staff, and get involved. We're always looking for folks to sit on county committees. So I really highly encourage our producers to talk to your county executive director, figure out when the election cycle is, and go for a county seat and learn about the programs and talk to your neighbors about the programs that you're involved in, and just kind of spread the word of what's going on with FSA and how it could benefit your operation. Even if it's just one time a year, I would encourage you, if you're in agriculture, to go out there and visit your county office. And you don't have to be a big farmer. You don't have to be out in rural America, because the unique and great thing about FSA is we're available to service multiple sizes of farm and ranch operations, and we have a big new push on urban agriculture. Over the years, we've had urban county committees and we've had some urban programs, but over the next year, we're going to have a bigger push on promoting urban agriculture, and we're excited for some of the new things that are going to come out of those conversations.
Have you yourself as a rancher made a lot of use of FSA programs?
In the past, my family has, my grandmother and my uncles, and I participated in a few different programs in the past. So yes, definitely we have utilized the Farm Service before out in Quay County and in Guadalupe County.
Anything else you want to let listeners know?
Yeah, I would really highly encourage you all to check out our website. You could do a simple Google search of New Mexico FSA, and we would be the top one that would come up on that search. Or you could go to www.fsa.usda.gov and go down and search for the New Mexico State Office and take a look at our webpage. View our list of county offices, we'll view our tab on programs, And while you're on our website, enroll into our local newsletter. We do a monthly newsletter with important information and important dates for producers so that they're made well aware of what's available for programs and assistance during that month.
Jonas, Moya, thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely, Mary Charlotte. Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate your time.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.